Hi everyone, my name is Suki So. I'm a physical therapist in an outpatient hospital-based clinic, and I'm here to give today's lecture on accessibility, environmental considerations, and assessment. A little background information about me. I've been a PT for about 10 years. I went to PT school out in Boston and did my last internship out in Portland and have been here ever since. I used to help out in this class a couple years ago, but took a break to take care of my kids, and I'm really looking forward to being back here again. Before I start this lecture, I wanted to give credit to Dr. Katie Farrell, who put this presentation together, and I'm really looking forward to presenting this. All of the objectives that we will go over in today's lectures are listed here. In general, we will be discussing the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, laws and regulations, in addition to other federal legislations regarding access. We will also go over and understand the role of physical therapists with accessibility and how to assess and determine modifications for the public and home environment for patients using our skills and knowledge of ADA recommendations and also within our scope of practice. To start off, here are 3 YouTube links you can watch to help understand why adequate accessibility is so important for those in a wheelchair. I was going to have the videos linked into this PowerPoint, but had a hard time executing it, so feel free to watch the videos when you get a chance. The links are on the slides, so you can just click on them. But to start off, the first video is about a woman who presents with some basic challenges with day-to-day living in a wheelchair that we may not realize go anywhere from speed bumps, curbs, even uneven floors in your apartment. The second video is more of a humorous video of a guy in a power chair trying to navigate the streets of Manhattan and Brooklyn in search of a rainbow bagel. And then the third video is about flying on an airplane with a wheelchair. All right. So over the years, there have been several crucial legislations created to address accessibility. The first one is the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. This requires basically that new and remodeled buildings funded by the U.S. federal government must be accessible to the public. This does not apply to buildings that were built prior to 1968. However, if the building were to be remodeled or altered, it must meet the standards set by the ABA. So if you go to some of these older cities like New York or Boston, you may find that some of these buildings don't meet ABA or ADA requirements because they're older, they were built before 1968, and they also haven't been remodeled since. So that's why in the clip that you saw about the Rainbow Bagel, he was having a hard time even just getting into some of these stores or buildings. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is an affirmative action stating that a person cannot be discriminated from employment based on disability. The Fair Housing Act of 1988, this is basically the amendment that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in housing sales, rentals, or financing. The act then extended this protections to people with disability or families with children with disabilities and was intended to increase housing opportunities for those folks. This act also allows people to have service animals within their homes and also allowing tenants to have modifications to their apartment units at their own expense with the permission of their landlord. So this could also include putting grab bars in the bathrooms or around the hallways in addition to ramps just to get into their apartment building. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, this is probably something that we're more familiar with, but essentially the ADA was created to now expand accessibilities to privately owned businesses and facilities like restaurants, stores, um, and just things that are generally to the public. And and also that small businesses must not discriminate employment, transportation, and state and local government activities like healthcare facilities, courts, and voting places for people with disabilities. Any barriers that are created or have been there for quite some time should be removed within reason. And then also, just public areas like the bathroom facilities or common areas should also be accessible. Overall, these mandates only represent minimum standards. They don't apply to a person's individual needs within their home. Therefore, any home modifications that need to be done should not be standardized based on the ADA compliant rules, but individualized based on the person's needs. If regulations aren't being followed, individuals can contact three different departments. The first one is the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The second is the U.S. Access Board, and then the third is the U.S. Department of Justice. There are three documents that contain the standards and specifications for meeting the federal mandates on environmental accessibility. The first one is the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards, which are on the Access Board website. This website has quite a bit of information, including information about the Architectural Barriers Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. The second one is the American National Standard Accessible and Usable Buildings and Facilities. It is a nationally recognized standard of technical requirements of making buildings accessible. I will say that this document is something that you have to purchase and is really used for reference purposes. Physical therapists have a vital role for our patients when it comes to accessibility. We are there to help our patients have a voice for their needs within the community. This ranges anywhere from our pediatric population for their playgrounds and schools, or even up to the adult patient populations for healthcare facilities, gyms, swimming pools, and even churches. Part of our role as a physical therapist is to perform home and workspace assessments. We're finding that people are wanting to stay in their homes much longer these days, so as individuals get older, home modifications are becoming more popular. But these modifications also include those who are experiencing sudden medical changes like having a stroke or spinal cord injuries, or even progressive diseases like MS and Parkinson's. Physical therapists also assess the skill levels needed for individuals to meet environmental challenges or needed to complete ADLs and functional mobility safely. For example, to transfer from a wheelchair to a bed, what kind of strength or transfer skills will this need? Or in order for a person to be able to brush his teeth in the bathroom, how much space is needed for his wheelchair to turn and to face the mirror, and how high and how far can their toothbrush be located from a seated position? These are just a few examples. These are, there are other examples and skills assessment needed for the bedroom, for the kitchen, for the garage. We can also make recommendations for assistive devices or adaptive equipment or safety devices. We can make modifications on how to perform a task and how a home is designed. We can rearrange the environment, like their home, school, or even cars, to make it easier to perform a transfer or even just to reduce the risk of falling. Caregiver education is also a vital skill that we can provide as a PT. Oftentimes, caregivers can tell you what they are currently doing to take care of their loved ones, but may need help as the disease progresses or as the patients get older, less mobile, heavier, or even taller. Whatever settings you may be in, the needs of your patients will vary. The best thing to do is to listen to your patients and caregivers and what their concerns are and goals are within their home. Knowing what kind of resources are out there are extremely helpful as well. And this could be, knowing who your local vendors are, where the medical supply stores are, What does DME cover based on the patient's insurance coverage? The state and local counties also have services that are helpful to know and to give as resources for your patients. If possible, visiting a patient's home will give you the best idea of what a person's needs and recommendations will be. I will say, since doing telehealth since March because of the pandemic, it has been extremely helpful to do more home assessments this way. It's probably the closest thing to home health you'll probably get and really get to know your patients. And I will say that this is probably one of the things that I've appreciated doing telehealth. Over in the top right hand corner, you'll see a chart with seat width, chair width, occupied width. The seat width is literally from side to side of the seat cushion. The chair width is including the seat cushion plus the wheels, and then the occupied width is including the seat cushion, the wheels, and the patient's arms in order to propel the wheelchair. Most of the ADA compliant spacings that you will see are based off the standard seat width of 18 inches. Based on your patient's wheelchair size, home recommendations may vary, but most of the standards that you will see are off the 18 inches. For example, a seat with an 18-inch width will need a minimum of 60 inches or 5 feet to make a full circle turn. Okay. The link here is to give you more information about measurement requirements for different scenarios, and then the YouTube clip here is a demonstration of how one would navigate a restroom with a wheelchair and how important it is to have that 5 feet of spacing. All right, assessing. All right, so in order for us to do a home assessment, a person must be able to enter their home. So our job really starts as soon as your patient gets out of the car. Things to really consider and asking and observing are: how far is the car from the entrance? What is the layout? Will they be on the passenger side or on the driver's side? Is there a driveway, or can they access their home through the garage? What kind of surfaces will they be on? Will it be gravel, concrete, or grass? Is there a slope, stairs, covered, uncovered surfaces? So these are just a few things to even take a look at right from the get-go. So as you can see here in these 3 pictures, there are a variety of different terrains when it comes to entering a home or a building. I would challenge you, the next time you go to a friend's house or even just entering another home or a building, take a look and see what kind of entrance they have. And think about, like, if you were in a wheelchair, would you be able to enter this home easily, or how would you enter it? Grade and cross slope. Grade is referring to the slope of a ramp, and the ADA requires a minimum slope to be about a 1 to 12 rise over run ratio, which is roughly 8.3%. The rise is considered where you see D here, from the bottom to the top of D, and then the run is considered from A to D. And for example, if the distance that is needed to build a ramp from the driveway to the front door is 12 feet, then the rise should be at least a foot. If the rise is less, then the grade will be lower, allowing wheelchair propulsion to be a lot easier. The crossslope is referring to the slope measured perpendicular to the direction of travel, typically on the sidewalk. Most sidewalks have a mild one for drainage, but the steeper one exists and can cause a tipping hazard, which is why most crossslopes have a minimum requirement of a 1 to 48 ratio. Curb cutouts are required on public sidewalks and should provide a landing of a minimum of 36 inches. The landings on these ramps allow people with mobility impairments to move completely off the ramp and onto the sidewalk, and they also provide a level area for resting, turning, or even just reaching the pedestrian signal lights. When setting up an accessible path for entrance, it must be at least 36 inches wide, have a smooth surface, and also a level surface. Not all buildings need to have every entrance accessible, but they at least have to have one. Moving on to assessing stairs. Be sure to measure the height and depth of each step. Stair height ideally should be between 4 and 7 inches with a depth of 11 inches. The challenge that I often come across is that there are a lot of older homes that were built prior to when the standardizations were created, and so the stairs are either too narrow or come with a variety of different stair heights. There are usually the stairs going down to the basement, and typically that's where the laundry is. So take a look at the steps. The other thing that you want to make note of is if the stairs have rails. Handrails should be between 34 and 38 inches and on both sides ideally. Usually they'll be on one side, but it's definitely a lot better if you have them on both sides, especially if a person has a better function on one side. For example, if a person with hemiparesis needs to use the right rail to descend the stairs, then having the rails on the other side would be helpful to have them to use to ascend the stairs. Another thing to monitor is if the stairs are nosing. This lip that you see on the top image that's hanging over the step is called nosing. If a nosing is present, you want to try to minimize it if you think it would be a tripping hazard for your patient. You can do this by either having it flush with the stairs at an angle like you see with the red triangles, or even rounding the lip so it's shorter and less jagged. Applying traction or tread to the stairs can also be a great visual cue and provide grip to the stairs so that it decreases the risk of falling. If there are steps to the entrance that cannot be managed by the patient, a ramp may be necessary. If you guys are considering a ramp for your patients, consider if the ramp will be temporary or permanent because there are plenty of options out there. Depending on where you are practicing, look for local and state resources or even organizations that can provide some type of services, whether to install the ramps or even build a ramp for the patient. Some are free, some are provided at a lower rate, and some are just donated. Consider the grade of the ramp from your patient's perspective. Remember, the 1 to 12 ratio is just the minimum, but if your patient find it difficult to propel that 1 to 12 grade, whether it's because of weakness or the weight of the wheelchair, they may need a lower grade to make it easier to propel the ramp. Continuing on with ramps and ADA requirements, as I mentioned before, the maximum grade for ramps is a 1 to 12 rise over run ratio. In a person's home, it can be individualized to their preference, whether it's more or less. Generally speaking, most people like to have a lower grade, like around 1 to 15 ratio, since it allows them to propel and navigate the ramp with less effort. But the challenge is usually because of limited space. If we're needing a 1 to 15 rise over run ratio, essentially you need about 15 feet of a ramp in order to have a lesser grade. The width of a ramp should also be a minimum of 36 inches, but usually 48 inches is what is ideal. If you take a look at the chart about wheelchair width on slide 11, you'll see that the occupied width for an 18-inch seat width is about 36 inches. So if someone has a seat width greater than 18 inches, they may have a harder time going through a ramp that is 36 inches wide. Landings are also required at the top and the bottom of the ramp. If the ramp is greater than the 1 to 15 rise over run ratio, then the landing should be at least every 30 feet. Landings from a ramp should be at least 60 inches long, or roughly 5 feet, and as wide as the ramp. This is different from the landing dimensions from a curve that we talked about earlier, which was 36 inches wide, or long, 36 inches long. When the landing is part of a directional turn, there must be a clear width of at least 60 inches and a minimum length of 60 inches without being obstructed by handrails, vertical posts, edge protectors, or any other elements. The landing at the entrance should allow enough room for locking and unlocking the door, and also to open and close the door. And in Oregon, having a covered door makes it even helpful to open and close the door. So continuing on with ADA compliant ramps, we must have railings. Railings are required if the rise is greater than 6 inches. If we're going back to that 1 to 12 ratio, any ramp longer than 6 feet would require railings. Similar to the stairs, the rail should be on both sides and between 34 to 38 inches high from the ramp surface. The rail should extend out about 12 inches or a foot at the bottom and at the top of the rail if the rail itself is not continuous. So if you look at both of these pictures, you can see that there's about a foot extended out at the bottom and the top because the rail is not continuous with the ramp. They should also be about 1 to 1.5 inches off the wall, if there is a wall, and should provide some kind of a grip traction throughout the rail. We also want some kind of traction on the ramp itself to help the wheels from slipping. The edges of the ramp are also there to provide a barrier to stop the wheels from going off the ramp, and these should be at least 2 inches high. Some other things to consider when having a ramp is making it visible when it's dark, allowing better lighting, and also to see if it's possible to have some kind of covering. Obviously, it would be hard to have the whole ramp covered just based on the length of the ramp, but the doorway may be a good idea to have some kind of covering. There are different types of materials that can make up a ramp. Wood, concrete, metal. Each will have their pros and cons to them, but it really depends on cost, durability of weather, and maintenance, and really just if the ramps are intended to be temporary or permanent. Here are 2 other options for patients who still want to utilize other floors and when a ramp is not possible. The platform lifts is kind of like an elevator, as you can see on the left side. They can be used indoors or outdoors, and the stair glides, as you see on the right picture, is used mostly inside for stairs. The one in this picture here is a less cumbersome version. It's a lot more narrow, so people can also navigate the stairs if needed. But they do come in a variety of sizes, and one thing to consider is what is the size of the stair width. Let's move on to doors and doorways. An ADA compliant door should be a minimum of 32 inches wide, and this is measured from the inner door panel by the hinge to the inner door panel on the other side where the doorknob would be. Patient home doorways can be narrower, which is fine when not dealing with a wheelchair, but 32 inches is the minimum requirement when using a wheelchair. But just remember that the occupied width for a standard 18-inch seat cushion is 36 inches. I just measured my own bathroom door, which was 26 inches, which would have made a tight squeeze to get into the bathroom if using a wheelchair. But most likely, they would need to leave the wheelchair at the door or use another form of assisted device or find another transfer method or even get assistance from someone else. A lot of times patients just can't put in a wider doorway in their homes. One modifications that a person can do is get some offset hinges that gives the doorway an extra 1 to 2 inches, as you can see in this picture. You can also change the direction of how the door opens, which I'll talk about in the next few slides. With ADA compliant doors, they should not be more than 5 pounds, and a person should be able to open it with one hand. If a person has a storm or screen door, we need to consider how they will open, especially if the door opens out towards them. How to navigate thresholds will also be an area to educate. And also, as I mentioned before, having good lighting is very helpful when it comes to opening and closing doors. There are 2 videos on opening doors. I wasn't sure if the hyperlink would work, so I put the actual link on here as well, in addition to the hyperlink. The first one is from the guy who talked about flying on a plane in a wheelchair at the very beginning of the PowerPoint presentation. And in this clip, he actually talks about how to open a door in a wheelchair and the different strategies that he likes to use to make it easier to open the doors. The second video is from the US Access Board with video animations on how to open doors in different environments like buildings and bathrooms. So take a look at them. Let me know what you think. Here you can see the different door handles and different key options that you can use based on your patient's ability to use their fine motor skills or even the ability to open the door. If your patient has a hard time gripping a regular key, you can consider a wider key grip that's seen here. Other ideas to help open a door is to change the handles. Here are a few examples on the bottom pictures and also to the right. You can have a handle so a person can slide their arms through and pull open, or if they have a pretty decent wrist and hand strength to pull on a handle, you can have something like the second picture where they can use their hands or even just grip to pull on a bar handle. And if they can also use a lever arm for a door handle, you can also consider doing that. But if not, you can have some type of, you can also just jimmy rig a door handle so that it can be easier for the patient to open the door. I mentioned earlier that changing the direction of the door may be an option to make it easier to enter through a door or even to help maneuver around a doorway. Here are a few things to think about when changing how a door opens, whether it's opening towards you or away. When opening the door towards you, there needs to be at least an additional 18 inches on the handle side, like it's shown in figure A on the left side. However, when pushing the door open away from you, you don't need any additional space, which is kind of nice. And a few things to think about with this whole door opening process is, does the room have the space to swing the door open towards that side? For example, it may be easier to have the door swing towards you going into the bathroom so that it allows more space to maneuver once you're in the bathroom versus having the door swing into the bathroom that may take up some valuable real estate. This also means that getting out of the bathroom door would be easier to swing the door away from you. Now let's talk about hallways and open floor space. Hallways should be at least 36 inches wide to propel independently. This is based off of that 18-inch seat width that we keep coming back to, and the occupied width is 36 inches. Turning in a room from a hallway needs to be wider than 36 inches. Generally speaking, that 5-foot or 60-inch turning radius will be recommended. We also want a clear and unobstructed path to areas for obvious reasons. This also includes clear pathways around light switches, faucets, and outlets. Another thing to consider are the reach ranges, not only for light switches or door handles, but things like closets, cupboards, and shelving systems. In general, if a control switch is going to be approached from the front, then they should not be any higher than 48 inches or 4 feet. If there's a side approach option, then no higher than 54 inches. Regardless of whether it's the front or the side approach, the control switch should not be any lower than 15 inches. You might have seen some sinks in bathrooms that have an angled approach under the sink. This is to help with the knee space when using a wheelchair. The minimum requirement for a knee clearance should be 11 inches deep from 9 inches above the ground. So if you look at this picture, 9 inches above the ground where the toe is should be 11 inches deep, and then at 27 inches above the ground should be 8 inches deep, which allows for that angled approach look. Also consider the toe clearance, which should be clear at least above 9 inches above the ground. And then in addition to having adequate knee and toe space, we need to make sure that the area under the sink is also safe from rough surfaces or even plumbing systems that might be exposed. The last thing we need or want is to have someone injure their legs because they couldn't feel the hot water plumbing system on their legs. This is probably not new information to you, but be sure to educate your patients on keeping the floors clear of clutter, cords, and throw rugs. Sometimes animals can also get in the way, but I usually find them more helpful as a companion than a hazard. The type of surface can also help maneuver around in a wheelchair inside the home. Obviously, firm surfaces like wood, laminate, or tile will be much easier to navigate than carpet. But if a patient really loves their carpet or doesn't have an option of changing their carpet, considering getting a carpet that has a low profile or even putting a firm pad in high traffic areas. Most homes will have a mix of both hard surfaces and carpet, but regardless, any transitions between the surfaces that are greater than a quarter inch needs to have a beveled edge. Here is a picture of an ADA kitchen setup. In this picture, you can see the sink has an angled knee space area. The counters are pretty low to navigate and to be utilized in a wheelchair. The other things to look at are the shelving system. They're pretty low. Um, the oven is a flat, and the options are, or the knobs are on the side. Okay. Other things to consider are different shelving options, the cabinetries. As you can see on the top right picture, there are shelving systems that pull out, which makes it easier to take things out, but also just to see what you have. Okay? Or even a pull-out cutting board can be super helpful to get close to your cutting board and also get your knees underneath the cutting board to utilize it a little bit easier. You might want to consider an electric stove over a gas stove to make it safer with a less risk of having something catch on fire as well. Moving on to the bathroom. The bathroom is probably one of the hardest rooms to modify for most people, but but a lot of times bathrooms just simply aren't big enough to accommodate the needs of a wheelchair. In an ideal bathroom, it should have adequate space to access the toilet, the tub or the shower, and the sink. The area around the sink should have at least 30 by 48-inch spacing, and the door to the bathroom shouldn't enter this sink area. You can see that in the dimensions on the picture on the right. The toilet should also be positioned so that the center of the toilet bowl is between 16 to 18 inches off the side wall. And what's nicer in an ideal world is if the toilet had enough spacing to be approached from both ends, but that usually will take up a lot of space. The toilet seat height should also be between 17 to 19 inches high as well. A clear turning radius of 60 inches or 5 feet is recommended as well. And also having grab bars in the shower and around the toilet is recommended to make transfers easier, but also to decrease the risk of falls. Here are some equipments that can make toileting and bathing a lot easier and safer. Grab bars that you can add for the toilet, for the bathtub, and even in the showers are extremely helpful and nice, and it just makes the transfers a lot easier. And this is probably one of the most common things I recommend for a lot of my patients if I feel like their balance is not the greatest, but they're still wanting to be independent and just to minimize their risk of falling. Shower benches are nice and super helpful in addition to removable shower heads so that people can also just continue to take a shower while sitting on the bench by removing the shower head. Some of these things are covered under durable medical equipment or DME and also under the patient's insurance, but a lot of the home equipments may not be covered, so it's always nice to know what are covered and what isn't. Most medical supply stores will sell equipment at a reasonable price, but sometimes you can even find used equipment either on Craigslist or at Goodwill or even on Amazon. For the bedroom, we need to think about the height of the bed to allow the patient to transfer in and out easier. We also need to consider which side of the bed they may sleep on in order to help with the transfer approach. It may require that the patient needs to switch sides of the bed if one side is easier than the other. For the closet, we may need to lower the closet rod or even have a pull down closet rod option. If lowering the rod, remember that it cannot be higher than 48 inches. And consider getting a wider door or even a pocket door or even a barn door to make the entrance to the closet a lot wider. The 60 degrees or the 60 inches turning radius rule also applies to the bedroom, but it is easier to accommodate this in the bedroom, mostly due to the fact that bedrooms are bigger compared to bathrooms, and furniture can be rearranged in the room to allow for the turning radius to happen. A person may have difficulty transferring independently in and out of their bed. Depending on their skill levels and needs, you may need adaptive equipment to help with the transfer. On the far left picture, we have a Hoyer lift, which is used when a person doesn't have the strength to weight bear through their legs or even is just too heavy to transfer on their own. The Hoyer lift allows a person to be lifted and transferred with minimal effort by the caregiver. The other two pictures are different types of rails. The one you see in the middle is a removable bed rail that you can slide under the mattress. These are nice because you can move them up or down the mattress and depending on where the patient needs it. It's also less bulky and easy to use and no major installations required. The picture on the far right is more of a stand-up pole that goes from floor to ceiling and can be used to help a person stand up from a seated position, like from their bed, their wheelchair, or even couch. So you can pretty much install them wherever, depending on where the person needs it the most when standing, and also be somewhat independent. And this is also pretty easy to install. The main goals when we as PTs do home assessments are to make sure that the patient's home is safe and accessible, to allow to be as independent as possible, to troubleshoot mobility challenges within their homes, and to make other recommendations around the home to help the patient and caregivers. These two links that you see here give you a sample idea of home evaluations. They're pretty easy to follow and it gives you a list of areas to look around at the house to reduce risk of falls and also to make the home safe and apply any modifications that a person may need. If a patient is in rehab and is getting close to being discharged for home, it's helpful to practice some general transfers or tasks that they may need to do at home. This includes learning how to do the stairs with the rail on a particular side, getting in and out of car or even in and out of their bed, or even standing to open the refrigerator. You may need you may also need to make some modifications before the patient gets home, like installing a ramp or even moving the bedroom downstairs. But most of the modifications will probably happen once your patient gets home, just because there's a better idea of what the patient needs at that time. And modifications are not cheap. So being resourceful and getting the biggest bang for your buck is probably the best way, and that just comes with experience. Sometimes insurance can cover some of the modifications. It just really depends on what the modification needs are. You can also look to see what kind of resources are out there that may help cover some costs. Um, these are just two examples of resources available in Portland. The first one is Refit Portland. Refit Portland is a local organization that helps with small house repairs such as installing grab bars, help with any electrical repairs or minor plumbing issues, and also small carpentry repairs that a person may need. They do provide services in the Tri-County areas, but what they provide varies depending on which county they live in. And I believe that I believe they also serve other areas of Oregon as well, but you'll just have to go online to see what other counties that they um, can service. If you go to their website, there's also a resource packet that you can download of the various services that they do provide. The second one is through the City of Portland. The City of Portland Community and Civic Life has a list of resources that people can reach out if they need assistance or funds to help make their business or home more accessible. You can also reach out to local churches or secondhand stores for used equipment. As good as we are at home assessments, our scope of practice does have limitations, and we also need other disciplines to get involved. This is what the multidisciplinary system is super helpful for. If someone is having difficulty with ADLs, like getting dressed or preparing a meal, then an occupational therapy referral will be helpful. OTs can also help with strategies if vision is affecting their day-to-day function. Speech therapy can also help if someone presents with cognitive impairments, swallowing, and obvious speech concerns. And as you can see, with PT, OT, and speech, we are there to make sure that our patients are safe, and safe. DME, or durable medical equipment vendors, generally cover wheelchairs, and lifts are dependent on insurance coverage and if there's a solid justification as to why a person needs a lift. The lifts tend to be a little bit harder to get covered. Grab bars and ramps are generally not covered by insurance, but really is dependent on what type of insurance the patient has. If a patient lives alone and there are concerns for their safety, a life alert may be something worth considering. Nowadays, with technology, options of a life alert can be much cooler looking and less bulky like they used to be. They come with, they look like bracelets or even necklaces. Some of the smartwatches like Samsung or Apple Watch has a fall detection that you can set up that will notify a family member if a person has fallen as well. So that pretty much covers the accessibility and evaluation portion of this lecture. Before I finish, I wanted to go over some basic wheelchair concepts before the next lecture given by Dr. Aaron McMullen. Some of the components we already talked about in this lecture and are pretty self-explanatory, but let's go over some terminology that may not be as familiar. So the first one is camber. So if you look in the left picture, on the wheel, the camber is essentially the measurement of the angle of the wheel in relation to the surface that it's on to the ground. If the wheel is completely straight up like it is here, then the camber angle measurement is considered at 0. Sometimes you'll see the wheels angled inwards where the bottom of the wheelchair is wider and then at the top of the wheel it's a little bit more narrow. And that is considered a negative camber measurement. And what's nice about this is that it provides a lot more lateral stability for the person using the wheelchair. And then hanger angle, which you see on the picture of the right. The hanger angle is the angle of the leg rest. And when talking about the angle itself, it's really defined by the angle, the black line under the hanger angle, and then also to the leg rest. So that is the angle, and Dr. McMullen will actually talk a little bit more about the importance of these angles when it comes to the leg rest. That's it. So thanks for sitting through this presentation. Be sure to take a look at the videos because they'll give you a better sense of some of the challenges that people might face when they're navigating the community and their home in a wheelchair. Oftentimes, like things that we don't really realize that can be an issue. Email me if you have any questions about the presentations. More than happy to answer them. And I look forward to seeing and meeting each and every one of you guys. I'm looking forward to being back on campus and getting the semester started. Thanks.